In 1914, Henry Ford announced that he was cutting the workday at his Highland Park plant from 9 hours to 8. The press called it generosity. Economists called it visionary. Workers called it a miracle. What nobody called it, what nobody asked out loud, was the question that changes everything once you ask it. Why 8? Not 7, not 6, not the 10 that had already been the reform. 8. I spent a long time trying to find the answer. What I found had nothing to do with worker welfare. It had everything to do with a calculation so precise it could only have been made by someone who had already decided what workers were for. I came to this through a man most people have never heard of. His name was Robert Owen. In 1817, almost 100 years before Ford made his announcement, Owen stood before a crowd in London and proposed a division of the day that he believed was the natural law of human existence. 8 hours labor, 8 hours recreation, 8 hours rest. He called it the 10 and 2 system for a while, then settled on thirds, equal thirds. He printed it on banners. He marched with it. He built an entire commune in Indiana called New Harmony around the principle that human time should not be owned. New Harmony collapsed in 2 years. Owen died nearly broke, but his slogan survived him by a century. And when Ford announced the 8-hour workday in 1914, the newspapers did not mention Robert Owen once. Here is what the official history leaves out. Ford did not give workers 8 hours. He gave the factory 8 hours and gave workers what was left. The distinction sounds small. It is not small. Owen's 8 hours of labor came with 8 hours of what he called recreation, time that belonged to the worker entirely, time for education, for civic life, for the kind of human development that Owen believed was the only thing that separated a citizen from a machine.
Ford's 8 hours came with a personnel department, a sociological department, he called it, staffed with inspectors who visited workers' homes to determine whether they were spending their remaining 16 hours in ways Ford approved of: cleanliness, sobriety, thrift, Americanization. The 8-hour day did not free workers' time, it audited it. The Ford Sociological Department employed over 50 investigators by 1916. These men showed up unannounced. They checked whether workers kept their houses clean, whether they had savings accounts, whether they drank alcohol, whether their wives worked outside the home. Workers who failed the inspection did not receive Ford's famous $5 daily wage. They received $2.50. The raise that made headlines around the world, the raise that caused men to line up outside the Highland Park gates in the middle of a Michigan winter, was contingent on living the way Ford had decided a worker should live. Not 8 hours, 24. Now, here's the question nobody asks. Why did Ford need the sociological department at all? If the 8-hour day was about productivity, about the scientific management theories that Frederick Winslow Taylor had been publishing since 1911, if the logic was simply that rested workers produce more, then you do not need inspectors. You need clocks. The inspectors tell you something else. They tell you that the 8-hour day was never only about what happened inside the factory. It was about producing a specific kind of worker who would exist in a specific kind of way during the hours the factory did not own. A worker who saved, who did not drink, who did not organize, who did not use his recreation time the way Robert Owen had intended. Frederick Winslow Taylor published The Principles of Scientific Management in 1911, 3 years before Ford's announcement. Taylor's system, which he called Taylorism, was not about fairness. He was explicit about this. His stated goal was to determine the maximum amount of work a human body could perform without breaking down permanently. He timed workers with a stopwatch. He broke every motion into its smallest components. He calculated the exact number of seconds it should take to lift a shovel, to carry a load, to turn a bolt. Then he set the pace at the upper limit of what he had determined a body could sustain over a working life. Not a comfortable pace, the limit. The point just before the machine breaks down and has to be replaced. Taylor's system required a specific day length to function. Too long, and workers broke down faster than they could be trained. Too short, and the setup time, the time it took to begin each task from a stopped position, consumed a disproportionate share of total output. 8 hours was not chosen because it was humane. 8 hours was chosen because it was the length at which Taylorist efficiency calculations produce their optimal output per unit of labor cost. The 8-hour day is an industrial engineering solution. Owen called it natural law. Ford called it generosity. Taylor called it science. What it actually was the answer to a question workers were never told was being asked. In 1926, Ford reduced the work week to 5 days. Again, the press called it visionary. Again, workers called it a gift. Ford explained his reasoning in an interview that has been quoted selectively ever since. The full quote is less comfortable than the version that appears in business history textbooks. Ford said that it was not enough to simply pay high wages. Workers had to have enough time to spend those wages. More time off meant more consumption. More consumption meant more demand. More demand meant more production. More production meant more workers needed to buy more things. The 5-day week was not designed around what workers needed. It was designed around what the economy needed workers to do with their time when they were not working. Owen had called that time recreation. Ford had a different word for it. He called it the market. This is the detail I cannot stop returning to. Robert Owen built New Harmony in 1825. He believed that if you gave people time, genuinely free time, they would educate themselves, organize themselves, govern themselves, and eventually have no need for the kind of owner who required a sociological department to monitor how they slept. New Harmony failed. Owen's critics said it proved that people could not manage freedom. But New Harmony did not fail because Owen was wrong about human nature. It failed because the men who supplied it with credit stopped supplying it with credit. The same mechanism, different century. There is a woman almost nobody remembers named Josephine Goldmark. In 1908, she compiled a legal brief for a Supreme Court case called Mueller versus Oregon. The case was about whether Oregon could legally limit women's working hours to 10 per day. Goldmark's brief, over 100 pages of medical and sociological evidence, argued that long working hours damaged the physical health of women in ways that affected their capacity to bear children. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously in Oregon's favor. The legal basis for limiting working hours in America, the foundation on which the 8-hour day was eventually built into law, was not that workers deserved time. It was that the state had an interest in the reproductive capacity of female workers. The hours were not protected because they belonged to the worker. They were protected because they belonged to the next generation of workers. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 established the 40-hour week as the federal standard. It passed after years of labor organizing, strikes, and legislative battles that had been going on since the 1880s. The 8-hour day that Ford announced in 1914 did not become law until 1938. 24 years. And when it became law, it came with an exemption structure so detailed and so comprehensive that entire industries operated outside it immediately. Agricultural workers were exempt. Domestic workers were exempt. Railroad workers had their own separate act. The workers most likely to be black, most likely to be immigrant, most likely to be the people who had been doing the hardest labor the longest, were the workers the law did not reach. The 40-hour standard of 1938 has not been updated once. The last time Congress debated reducing the standard work week was 1979. The proposal was for a 35-hour week. It did not pass. The countries that have moved to 35 or 32-hour weeks, France, Iceland, parts of Scandinavia, have not seen the productivity collapses that American economists predicted. They have seen something else. Lower absenteeism, lower turnover, lower healthcare costs, higher reported satisfaction. The data exists. It has existed for decades. The argument that 8 hours is the natural human workday is not a scientific finding. It is a number chosen in 1817 by a utopian reformer, adopted in 1914 by an industrialist who sent inspectors to his workers' homes, written into law in 1938 with exemptions for the people who needed it most, and never revisited by a Congress that has raised its own salary 23 times since 1938. Here's the detail about Ford that his biographers mention but do not linger on. Henry Ford was deeply opposed to labor unions. He employed a private security force called the Service Department, run by a former Navy boxing champion named Harry Bennett, whose investigators infiltrated union organizing meetings, identified organizers, and had them beaten or fired. The Battle of the Overpass in 1937, when Bennett's men attacked United Auto Workers organizers outside the River Rouge plant, including a man named Walter Reuther, who would later lead the UAW for 20 years, was photographed by news cameras that Bennett's men tried to confiscate. The photos ran anyway. The man who gave workers the 8-hour day spent 20 years using organized violence to prevent workers from negotiating anything beyond what he chose to give them. The gift and the fist were the same hand. Robert Owen believed the 8-hour day was the beginning, the first step toward a society in which no person's time was owned by another person's capital. He believed that once workers had the time, they would use it to demand more. He was right about the first part. He was wrong about the second. What workers got with their 8 hours was not Owen's vision of self-directed education and civic participation. They got Ford's vision of a market. Leisure time became consumption time. Recreation became entertainment. The time that Owen believed would produce citizens produced instead a second economy in which the wages paid during the 8 hours of labor were recovered during the 16 hours that followed. I keep returning to the sociological department. 50 inspectors. Unannounced home visits. savings accounts, sobriety, Americanization, the $5 day conditioned on behavior Ford approved of. Because the inspectors reveal something that the official story of the 8-hour day cannot accommodate. They reveal that the people who designed the system understood from the beginning that the hours outside the factory were as economically important as the hours inside it. Owen called those hours free. Ford called them an extension of the audit. The question of which vision won is not a historical question. It is a question you can answer by looking at how you spend your evening. The 40-hour week has been the standard for 86 years. The technology that existed in 1938 has been replaced several times over. Productivity per worker hour in the United States has increased by over 300% since 1948. The share of that productivity captured by wages has declined every decade since 1973. We are producing more per hour than any generation in American history. We are working the same number of hours that Henry Ford decided was optimal for his assembly line in 1914. The math is there. The question is, who decided the math would never be revisited? And the answer, if you look at who funds the think tanks that publish the studies that advise the committees that never schedule the votes, sounds less like an accident than like a plan that has been working exactly as designed for a very long time. Owen's banners still exist. Some of them are in the archives of the British Library. 8 hours labor, 8 hours recreation, 8 hours rest. He printed them in 1817. Ford announced the 8-hour workday in 1914. The Fair Labor Standards Act passed in 1938. And we are still, in the year you are watching this, working to a schedule that a man with a stopwatch calculated was the upper limit of sustainable human output, endorsed by a man who sent inspectors to make sure workers slept the way he approved of, written into law with exemptions for the people who needed it most, and never once reconsidered by the people whose salaries it does not apply to. I am not telling you what to think. I am telling you that 8 is not a natural number. It was chosen by specific people for specific reasons, and those reasons were not yours. Why did Ford need 50 home inspectors if the 8-hour day was simply about productivity? Why did the law that established the standard come with exemptions for the workers who needed it most? Why has the standard not been updated in 86 years despite 300% gains in productivity? Why did New Harmony fail the moment its credit was cut? Why do we still call it a gift?